Hello everyone and welcome back to more Studio. This time, Christopher Nolan has taken on a story that is not only older than almost every Hollywood movie ever made, but older than cinema itself, older than the modern novel, and even older than a large part of the civilization we recognize today. This is a story people have been telling for more than 3,000 years. It is the story of a king who survives a 10-year war and wants only one thing, to return home. But the journey that should take a few weeks ends up lasting for years. Along the way, he faces storms, monsters, gods, temptation, and death. But one thing Nolan's film makes clear very early is that none of these creatures represents the greatest danger in Odysseus's path. The real danger is Odysseus himself. Or, to be more precise, the man Odysseus has become after 20 years of war, violence, survival, and loss. Now he has to discover whether he is still the same person his wife and son have been waiting for. I have seen the film, and in this video, I'm going to review it without spoilers. That means I will not reveal the ending, any major twists, or any important events that could ruin your first experience of the movie. We are going to look at exactly what Nolan has done with one of the most important stories in human history, why some of his changes are brilliant, why others hurt the movie, how the cast performs, and whether this is genuinely one of Christopher Nolan's greatest films, or simply his biggest and most expensive one, because those two things do not necessarily mean the same thing. So before we go any further, what is the film actually about? To answer that, we need to briefly understand where this story begins. Odysseus is the king of an island kingdom called Ithaca. Now, when I say king, do not imagine the ruler of some enormous empire. Ithaca is a relatively small island kingdom. It does not have the military strength of Agamemnon, the wealth of Sparta, or the strategic importance of Troy. Odysseus is not the strongest warrior in Greece either. Achilles is stronger than him, Ajax has greater physical power, and Agamemnon commands far more ships and soldiers.
What makes Odysseus different from all of them is his mind. He is the kind of man who tries to solve a problem through negotiation, language, deception, or strategy before reaching for a sword. The problem is that this same intelligent man is responsible for creating an oath that eventually helps cause the Trojan War. Odysseus designs an agreement between the Greek kings in an attempt to prevent a war. But years later, that same oath comes back to trap him, forcing him to leave his wife and newborn son behind and go to Troy. The tragedy of his character begins right here. The man who tried to prevent war through intelligence becomes a prisoner of the system he created. The Trojan War is supposed to be a short military campaign, but it lasts 10 years. After those 10 years, the war finally ends through the famous plan involving the Trojan horse, another idea created by Odysseus. The war is over. The Greek heroes can finally board their ships and return home. But Odysseus' journey back to Ithaca takes another 10 years. That means his son is a newborn baby when Odysseus leaves and a grown man by the time his father is expected to return. His wife, Penelope, has spent all those years waiting for him, but no one knows whether Odysseus is alive or dead. His body has never been found. His ships have not returned. There is no reliable information about what happened to him. Meanwhile, Ithaca has been without a king for years. A group of powerful aristocrats and suitors has entered Odysseus' palace, each hoping to marry Penelope and claim the throne through her. So the movie is following two journeys at the same time. One journey takes place at sea, where Odysseus is trying to find his way home. The other takes place in Ithaca, where Penelope and Telemachus must protect their home and their future without their king. Nolan places these two storylines beside each other in a way that slowly makes us understand that returning home is not simply a geographical problem. Before Odysseus can reach Ithaca, he has to understand exactly who is going to walk through that door. Now, why is The Odyssey such a perfect story for Christopher Nolan?
When Nolan first announced that he was making The Odyssey, a lot of people were surprised. We normally associate Nolan with science fiction, time, memory, physics, layered realities, and characters whose own minds become battlefields. Here, however, we are dealing with Greek gods, strange creatures, witches, cursed oceans, and monsters. At first glance, it feels like Nolan has entered a kind of world he has never explored before. But when you look more closely at the original story, you realize that The Odyssey fits Nolan almost perfectly. First of all, it is a story about time. Odysseus is constantly moving toward home, but the closer he tries to get, the more time he loses. His destination remains in the same place, but the people living there continue to change. His son grows up, his wife grows older, the balance of power changes, and the memory of Odysseus gradually begins to replace the actual man. To the people of Ithaca, he is no longer simply a human being. He has become a story. One person says he is a hero. Another says he is dead. Someone believes he abandoned his family, while someone else still believes he will return.
This is exactly the kind of territory Nolan has always been interested in, the point where reality and the stories people tell about reality can no longer be easily separated. The second important subject is memory. Odysseus is not only trying to find his way home, he is also trying to understand his own past. What did he do during the war? What decisions did he make? Who did he save? And who died because of his choices? In most epic stories, when the hero wins the war, we are shown a story of victory. But the Odyssey begins after victory is over, when the characters are forced to live with its consequences. The Trojan War is about glory. The Odyssey is about the cost of that glory. Nolan takes that part of the story and pushes it to the center of the film. That is why this movie is less about a man fighting monsters and more about a soldier fighting his own memories. Now, one of the biggest questions is what Nolan actually does with the mythology, and more specifically, how he handles the fantasy elements.
Would he remove the gods and magic like the movie Troy and explain everything realistically? Or would he fully embrace fantasy and place the gods directly on the battlefield? The answer is that he does neither. Nolan chooses a path somewhere in the middle. The supernatural elements are present, and the movie is not trying to turn the story into a completely realistic historical drama. But it always leaves a gray area around what we are seeing. In many scenes, you can accept an event as genuine intervention from the gods. At the same time, you could interpret that same event as the result of fear, memory, guilt, trauma, or the character's religious beliefs. For me, this is one of the film's strongest decisions. If Nolan had removed all the fantasy, what remained would no longer feel like the Odyssey. But if he had presented the gods like superheroes constantly appearing and physically controlling the action, they might not have fit naturally into his cinematic world. Here, the gods are often felt more than they are directly shown, sometimes through sound, sometimes through nature, sometimes through dreams, and sometimes through faces that may genuinely exist or may have been created by Odysseus's mind. The result is a film that feels historical, fantastical, psychological, and in certain moments, almost like religious horror. You are never completely sure whether a storm is simply a storm, a punishment from a god, or the physical expression of Odysseus's guilt. And the interesting part is that the film does not have to choose between those explanations. All three may be true at the same time. But here is where the journey becomes more interesting. The monsters in this story are not simply monsters. Without getting into specific story events, one of Nolan's main ideas is to connect every creature and obstacle in the journey to something inside Odysseus and his men. This is not a movie where the heroes arrive on an island, fight a monster, defeat it, and move on to the next level. Almost every encounter is a test. In one place, Odysseus's pride is tested. Somewhere else, it is the crew's desire for pleasure. In another section, it is their fear of death. There are moments about the desire to forget the past.
And there are moments that ask how far a commander has the right to go when deciding who must be sacrificed so that others can survive. This gives the journey a sense of unity. The different adventures are not completely disconnected from one another. Each one opens up another part of Odysseus's character. But this decision also creates one of the film's weaknesses. Some creatures become symbols and metaphors before they are given enough time to become interesting characters of their own. You may still want to learn more about a particular island, culture, or creature, but the film has already delivered its psychological meaning and moved on to the next part of the journey. In Homer's poem, the world feels larger than Odysseus. The gods, monsters, and people of the different islands have their own motivations, personalities, and rules. In Nolan's film, there are moments when it feels like the entire world has been designed specifically to explain Odysseus's psychological condition. That gives the movie stronger thematic unity, but it also removes some of the mystery and strangeness of Homer's world. There is another major idea running through the entire film, and that is civilization, but probably not in the way you might expect. There is one very important idea in the Odyssey that gives many scenes much more meaning once you understand it. The ancient Greeks had a sacred law concerning the relationship between a host and a guest. A host was expected to provide a traveler with food, shelter, and protection. The guest, in return, was expected to respect the home and not abuse the host's generosity. The religious reasoning was that the stranger entering your home might secretly be one of the gods in disguise, so it was safer to treat every guest with dignity. But the human meaning behind the law is much simpler. You can judge a society by the way it treats those with less power. The Greeks in the film see themselves as civilized. They believe they possess law, art, music, architecture, religion, and order. They assume that people living outside their world are barbarians. But Nolan asks a very simple question. If you are truly civilized, why do you behave exactly like the people you call savages the moment you gain power? The suitors enter Odysseus's palace as guests, but they remain there for years, consuming his food, disrespecting his servants, threatening his family, and planning to take control of his kingdom. At the same time, the Greeks themselves do not always behave like respectful guests when they enter foreign lands. This is where the line between civilization and barbarism begins to collapse. Clothing, palaces, poetry, and art do not automatically make someone civilized. What matters is how that person behaves once power is placed in their hands. And this part of the movie is not only about ancient Greece, it is completely relevant to the modern world. Almost every major civilization in history has described itself as the center of morality, order, and culture, while presenting outsiders as primitive or dangerous. But those same civilizations, when confronted with war, resources, and political power, often committed acts that were no different from the barbarism they claimed to oppose. Nolan does not stand in front of the audience and explain this message directly. He lets us watch the characters behave and reach the conclusion ourselves. And this brings us to Odysseus himself, because Nolan does not treat him like a traditional hero. Matt Damon's version of Odysseus will probably become one of the most discussed parts of the film. Odysseus is not supposed to look like an unstoppable, muscular, mythological warrior. He is a man who survives primarily through intelligence rather than physical strength. The problem is that his intelligence is also his greatest weakness. When someone spends years seeing every situation as a strategy, every conflict as a problem, and every human being as part of a plan, people gradually begin to look like pieces on a board. And once a human being becomes a piece on a board, sacrificing that person becomes much easier. Odysseus is constantly being forced to choose. Should he take a risk or retreat? Should he save one person or protect the larger group? Should he tell the truth or use a lie to keep people alive? The problem is that each time he uses intelligence to survive, he gets closer to believing that anything he does can be justified because survival was the goal. That is the part of his character the movie is most interested in. What is the difference between necessity and cruelty? If a commander sacrifices a few people to save many more, has he made the correct decision? Or has he simply created a logical explanation for an act of violence? The movie does not provide an easy answer, and fortunately, it does not turn Odysseus into either a completely innocent hero or an evil man we are expected to condemn. He is a survivor, a man who may have physically left the battlefield, but who still carries the war inside him. So how does Matt Damon actually work as Odysseus? Before seeing the movie, I was also one of the people who wondered whether Matt Damon was the right choice for Odysseus. His face, voice, and style of performance can feel very modern and very American. When we imagine Odysseus, we might picture someone rougher, more sunburned, and more visibly mythological. At the beginning of the movie, it takes some time to forget Matt Damon and begin seeing the character. But the further the film goes, the more the casting begins to work. The best thing about Damon's performance is that he does not try to make Odysseus look powerful and heroic in every scene. His version of the character is tired. He is physically and emotionally exhausted. He becomes afraid. He makes mistakes. And sometimes it is obvious that even he is no longer certain whether he has made the correct choice. Damon's strongest moments are not necessarily the action scenes. They are the pauses before a decision, the way he looks at his men, the moments when you can almost see him calculating several different outcomes before he says anything. But there is a problem in the screenplay. The movie does not always give Odysseus enough time alone. Just when it feels like we are about to enter more deeply into his mind, the story cuts to another timeline or another character. As a result, Odysseus's legendary intelligence is not always dramatized as effectively as it could have been. The film repeatedly tells us that he is intelligent, and it does show us that intelligence several times, but it could have spent more time allowing us to enjoy the actual process of watching his plans come together. That is not a weakness in Damon's performance. It comes more from Nolan's choices as a writer and storyteller. Meanwhile, back in Ithaca, Penelope is not simply sitting around and waiting for her husband to return. Anne Hathaway plays Penelope, Odysseus's wife, and she is a very strong choice for the role. When the Odyssey is summarized, Penelope is often reduced to the faithful wife who waits 20 years for her husband. But Penelope's waiting is not passive. She is trapped in the middle of a political crisis. Her husband is missing, her son has not fully established his authority, and a group of powerful men has occupied the palace, each hoping to marry her and become the next king of Ithaca. Penelope cannot simply draw a sword and force them all to leave. She has to fight with time, silence, negotiation, deception, and political performance. One wrong decision could lead to the death of her son or the complete collapse of the kingdom. Anne Hathaway communicates that pressure very effectively. Penelope cannot always reveal her true emotions because everyone around her is searching for weakness. A large part of Hathaway's performance is therefore built around looks, silence, and restraint. However, one of the film's weaknesses is that despite Penelope's importance, most of the emotional attention still belongs to Odysseus. We understand that her waiting is its own kind of war, but the film does not always remain inside her experience for as long as it should. The character is compelling and the performance is strong, but there was room for much greater development. And then we have Telemachus, a young man facing a very unusual problem. How do you become your own person when your father is already a legend? Tom Holland plays Telemachus, the son of Odysseus. Telemachus has spent almost his entire life without his father. He does not know Odysseus as a person, he only knows the stories people tell about him. To everyone else, Odysseus is the hero of Troy, the king of Ithaca, and one of the most intelligent men in Greece. But to Telemachus, he is also the man who was never home. That gives the character a very interesting conflict. If Odysseus is dead, Telemachus has to become king. If Odysseus is still alive, the son has to discover whether there is any room for his own identity beside a legend that large. Telemachus' storyline is about growing up, masculinity, power, and inheritance. But the more important question is whether a son can inherit his father's strength without also repeating his violence and carrying his wounds. Tom Holland is effective in scenes involving insecurity, frustration, anger, and the need to be taken seriously. But for some viewers, his extremely recognizable face may create a problem. During his first few scenes, you may still see Tom Holland or Spider-Man instead of Telemachus. Of course, that issue is not limited to Holland. This movie has so many famous actors that almost every few minutes another highly recognizable face enters the frame. Now we also need to talk about the enormous cast, because all these famous actors are both a strength and occasionally a distraction. The cast of The Odyssey is enormous. Matt Damon, Anne Hathaway, Tom Holland, Robert Pattinson, Charlize Theron, Zendaya, Lupita Nyong'o, John Bernthal, Elliot Page, and several other recognizable actors all appear in the movie. From a marketing perspective, this cast is incredible. Almost every viewer is going to be curious about at least one of these actors. But within the film itself, the result is not always positive. When you enter a mythological world, you need to see the characters rather than the celebrities playing them. Here, certain characters enter the frame, and before you even understand their purpose in the story, your mind recognizes the actor. Some of the stars have very little screen time, and their appearances feel more like promotional events than naturally developed roles. Other casting decisions work extremely well. Robert Pattinson gives one of the film's strongest performances. His character is not some enormous physical threat, but he is politically and psychologically dangerous. He's the kind of person who enters your home, sits at your table, eats your food, and slowly begins behaving as though he has always owned the place. Pattinson does not need to scream or exaggerate in order to become threatening. His calmness, his confidence, and the way he looks at other people make the character deeply unpleasant. He views the palace like a stage. He believes that if everyone behaves for long enough as though he already possesses power, the lie will eventually become reality. And that creates a fascinating similarity between him and Odysseus. Both men understand that controlling the story people believe can sometimes be more important than controlling the sword. Now let us move to one of the film's biggest achievements, its cinematography and sense of scale. Visually, The Odyssey is exactly the kind of film that should be seen on the largest screen possible. But people say that about every expensive blockbuster, so we need to explain what makes this one different. The difference is that Nolan does not only use the large format to make everything look bigger. Very often, he uses it to make human beings look smaller. When an ancient ship is placed in the middle of an endless ocean, you begin to understand how terrifying Bronze Age navigation must have been. There were no compasses, there were no accurate maps, there was no weather forecasting, and ships usually tried to remain close to the coastline. Once the land disappeared from view, sailors might never find their route again. A single storm could carry a ship hundreds of miles away and leave the crew in a place no one recognized. The film communicates that vulnerability extremely well. The sea is not simply a beautiful background, it is a character. Sometimes it represents the path home. Sometimes it becomes a prison. Sometimes it is an enemy. And sometimes it feels like a courtroom where Odysseus is being forced to answer for his actions. On land, Odysseus can speak to people, create plans, use architecture, and manipulate information. But he cannot persuade the ocean. He cannot negotiate with a wave, and he cannot deceive a storm. Some of the maritime images create a genuine sense of insignificance, not simply because they are beautiful, but because they remind you how small human beings are in relation to nature. Many shots in this movie could genuinely be framed and placed on a wall. The wooden ships, beaches, cliffs, caves, fire, and human figures disappearing beneath these enormous environments are all visually striking. But the movie does not only rely on massive wide shots. The same IMAX frame sometimes moves extremely close to the actors' faces so that we can see sweat, exhaustion, fear, and hesitation. The scale is not only used to display the landscape, it is also used to explain the emotional condition of the characters. But do all those practical effects and real locations actually matter? One of the biggest elements of the film's marketing has been the use of real locations, enormous sets, physical ships, and practical effects. But we need to make one thing clear. The fact that something was physically constructed does not automatically make a movie good. Audiences do not purchase tickets to watch behind-the-scenes footage. It does not matter whether a monster was created through puppetry, computer graphics, or a combination of the two. What matters is whether it has an effect on the audience. And in the best sequences of the Odyssey, the answer is yes. This world has weight. When a ship moves through the waves, it does not feel like a light model floating on digital water. The wood feels wet, the ropes pull against the body, the armor feels heavy, and when the creatures move, it feels like they are displacing the air around them. The combination of practical and digital effects makes many of these scenes feel physically present. This is especially effective when the film enters horror territory. Because the performers often have something physical in front of them, their eyes and reactions feel more natural, and the environments do not look like empty green screen stages. However, not every costume or design choice will convince every viewer. Nolan is not attempting a museum-perfect reconstruction of ancient Greece. Some of the designs are intentionally simple, rough, and functional. Sometimes this makes the world feel more authentic. At other times, certain costumes may seem slightly too clean, modern, or visibly designed. But the visuals are only half of the experience because the sound design is something you often feel before you consciously hear it. Sound in the Odyssey is not simply there to accompany the image. At times, it behaves like a physical force. The sound of oars, ropes, wooden ships, waves, breathing soldiers, metal, and drums constantly builds the world. Before you fully see certain dangers, you can already feel their presence through sound. Ludwig Göransson has not created a score that simply imitates ancient Greek music through a few historical instruments. The music combines drums, struck metal, industrial textures, and heavy layers of sound. It feels as though the past has been excavated from the ground and reconstructed using modern tools. You may not leave the theater humming a clear melody, but you will remember the physical pressure of the music. Of course, the traditional problem with Nolan's sound mixing is also present. There are moments when the music and effects become so loud and overwhelming that the dialogue is pushed underneath them. Nolan sees this as an emotional choice. He wants you to feel the pressure of the scene before understanding every individual word. But if you have previously struggled to hear dialogue in Nolan's movies, you'll probably experience the same problem here. We also need to talk about the film's nonlinear structure and whether it actually helps the story or only makes it more complicated. The film is not told chronologically. We follow several timelines and groups of characters, and the information is not always presented in the order in which the events occurred. Sometimes we see the result of a decision before learning why that decision was made. This structure is obviously very Nolan, but the important point is that Homer did not tell the Odyssey in a straightforward chronological order either. Nolan has not simply rearranged the timeline to place his personal signature on the film. The original story also begins in the middle of events, with large parts of the past being revealed through memories, stories, and testimony. So the structure is connected to the original nature of the Odyssey. You could even argue that Nolan has taken something already present in Homer and intensified it. The layered storytelling allows the past and present to constantly comment on each other. The war may be over, but when the movie cuts from the present to an image of Troy, we understand that the past is still happening inside Odysseus. The problem is that the opening introduces a huge amount of information very quickly. Kingdoms, characters, family relationships, gods, timelines, and locations all appear within a short period. If you have no familiarity with Greek mythology, the beginning may require a lot of concentration. The movie does not always pause to explain every detail. It assumes either that you already know some of the mythology, or that you are willing to assemble the pieces as the story continues. For Nolan fans, that will probably be part of the enjoyment. But if you're expecting a completely simple and direct fantasy adventure, the beginning may feel crowded. And this leads to one of the film's strangest problems. It is a long movie, but several parts still feel rushed. This is one of the strangest contradictions in the movie. The Odyssey is not short, but certain sections still move too quickly. The original story contains so many characters, islands, creatures, ideas, and events that even a long film cannot give everything enough time. Some sequences are allowed to breathe. We enter the environment, understand the space, feel the danger developing, and then experience the major event. Other sections end almost as soon as they become interesting. You may have only just become curious about a character or location when the film moves to the next stage. This will probably be more noticeable to viewers familiar with Homer. They know how significant some of these figures and creatures are in the original poem, but in the film they may only receive a few minutes of attention. The movie is simultaneously trying to be an epic, a fantasy film, a horror story, an anti-war narrative, and a psychological character study. The fact that it manages to hold so many of those elements together is an achievement by itself, but naturally, not every part receives as much space as it deserves. Another element that may divide audiences is the film's language and dialogue. Nolan has not made every character speak in an extremely poetic or ancient style. Some conversations are very direct and modern. On one hand, this makes the characters easier to understand. It does not feel like everyone is constantly reciting epic poetry. But on the other hand, some lines feel too contemporary. You may be looking at ancient clothing, ships, and architecture, only to hear a character speak in a way that sounds completely modern. For a moment, that can pull you out of the world. This is not a constant problem. The movie also contains powerful, memorable dialogue. But its language is not always completely consistent. Sometimes it feels mythological, sometimes psychological, and sometimes it sounds like a very modern conversation. So, is The Odyssey actually a horror film? The main genre is not horror, but the movie's best scenes clearly use the language of horror cinema. Nolan understands that when audiences already know what a famous monster looks like, simply showing the creature is not enough. He has to make us afraid of it again. That is why he focuses on darkness, sound, and closed spaces and limited visibility. You are often unsure exactly where the creature is, how large it is, or from which direction it might appear. Before seeing its full form, you feel its weight and presence. The best horror in the film does not come from jump scares. It comes from realizing how defenseless human beings are against some of these creatures and natural forces. Odysseus may be the most intelligent man in Greece, but certain things are so large, ancient, and uncontrollable that human intelligence begins to look very limited. And how faithful is the film to Homer? The simple answer is both yes and no. The central storyline, major characters, and many of the most recognizable elements remain intact, but Nolan is not trying to adapt the poem page by page. Some characters have been removed, some roles have been changed, certain adventures have been shortened or combined. Most importantly, the role of some gods has been reduced, while the psychological interpretation of events has become much more important. If you expect to see Homer's story reproduced exactly on screen, you may struggle with some of Nolan's choices. But if you approach the film as Nolan's personal interpretation of the Odyssey, many of the changes begin to make sense. Nolan is not only interested in what happened to Odysseus, he wants to understand what those events did to him. However, this approach also comes with a cost. Homer's gods and monsters were not simply symbols inside Odysseus's mind. They had their own personalities, desires, jealousy, love, and hostility. When those characters are transformed mainly into metaphors, the story becomes psychologically stronger, but the mythological world begins to feel smaller. Nolan has made the myth easier for a modern audience to understand. But in doing so, he has also removed part of the strangeness that made Homer's world so powerful. But underneath all the gods, monsters, and enormous images, the film is really asking what it means to return home. On the surface, the entire story is about Odysseus reaching Ithaca, but the movie gradually asks a more difficult question. If you return home after 20 years, is it still the same home you left? Your newborn son has become an adult. Your wife is no longer the same woman she was 2 decades ago. The kingdom has learned how to survive without you. People have turned you into a legend, and that legend may have almost no connection to the person you really are. At the same time, you are no longer the person who originally left. So what does returning actually mean? Does it simply mean that your body enters the same building again? Or does it mean that the people inside that home can still recognize you? For years, Odysseus imagines Ithaca as a fixed point. He assumes that he is the one changing while home remains exactly where he left it. But time does not only pass through the traveler, time also passes through the home. And perhaps that is the hardest part of Odysseus's journey. He may survive war, the sea, and the monsters, but he cannot defeat time. A body can return to a house. A life cannot return to the moment before it was broken. So bringing all of this together, what are the film's greatest strengths? If I had to summarize the strongest elements of the Odyssey, the first would obviously be its visual scale. This movie was genuinely designed for the cinema, and the ocean sequences, caves, ships, and natural landscapes are among the strongest images Nolan has ever created. The second major strength is the sound design. Even after some of the images fade from memory, the sound of the waves, drums, wood, and creatures will remain with you. The third strength is the film's interpretation of Odysseus. It does not simplify him into a traditional hero. His intelligence, courage, pride, guilt, and cruelty are allowed to exist at the same time. And the fourth strength is the gray area between reality and mythology. The movie allows you to decide how much of what you are seeing is literally real and how much might be shaped by memory, fear, trauma, or guilt. But the movie also has some clear weaknesses that are impossible to ignore. The biggest problem for me is how crowded the story becomes. There are so many characters and events that some of them do not receive enough development. The second problem is that despite the film's length, certain sections move too quickly. The third is that the enormous number of famous actors can occasionally distract from the world of the story. And the fourth is that in trying to make the mythology more human and psychologically understandable, Nolan reduces some of the strange, poetic, and cosmic qualities of Homer. That makes the story easier to understand. It does not always make it more interesting. So, who is actually going to enjoy this movie? If you enjoy Nolan's more serious films, nonlinear storytelling, enormous images, and psychological character studies, you will probably enjoy The Odyssey. If you are interested in Greek mythology, war stories, and morally complicated characters, the movie gives you a lot to think about. And if you can watch it in IMAX, this is one of those rare films where the difference created by the larger screen is genuinely important. However, if you are looking for a fast, simple fantasy filled with jokes, this is probably not the movie you were expecting. If you struggle with long films or multiple timelines, the opening may be difficult. And if you are deeply attached to Homer's original text, you should be prepared for major changes. This is not a word-for-word adaptation. It is Christopher Nolan's version of the Odyssey. So after everything we have discussed, where does that leave the film? The Odyssey is not a perfect film. Some characters needed more time. Some of the adventures end too quickly. The dialogue is not always consistent, and the movie struggles beneath the weight of its own ambition. But despite those problems, it is an experience that will not be easily forgotten. Nolan takes one of the oldest stories in human history and, instead of simply making its monsters larger, begins questioning the human being standing in front of them. He does not ask only how Odysseus can return home, he asks whether the man who finally arrives is still worthy of entering it. Does survival always mean victory? Can a commander justify every decision by calling it necessary? And is it possible for a person to leave a war behind while carrying that war inside himself for the rest of his life? For me, The Odyssey is an enormous cinematic experience, a bold adaptation, and an imperfect one. It may not be Nolan's most complete movie, but it is undoubtedly one of the most ambitious projects he has ever made. Even its weaknesses are worth discussing. Now, I want to know what you think. Would you prefer Nolan to remain completely faithful to Homer's original story, or would you rather see him rebuild the mythology through his own cinematic ideas? And do you think The Odyssey could become the greatest film of Nolan's career? Or are films like Interstellar, The Prestige, and The Dark Knight still impossible to beat? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like and subscribe to More Studio for more deep dives into cinema, mythology, and epic storytelling. Here, we do not simply explain what happens in a story, we try to understand what that story is saying about us.